Excellent. Well, I'm very excited today to be joined by my very good friend, Andrew Wilson, who is teaching pastor at King's Church London, author and conference speaker, as well as the director of numerous training programs and leadership training programs over the years. And today, Andrew and I are going to be talking about some of the cultural movements that have been going on over the past few years, looking at how we can discover or rediscover a sense of confidence in our faith in the face of quite an aggressive and advancing secularism. So anyway, Andrew, it's great to see you. Hello.
Hi, Jez. Good to see you.
Excellent. Oh, Andrew, first question before we get into that is, how are you, obviously? And I do care about your well-being.
Really well, haven't you?
I do care about your well-being. But more importantly, what have you learned? Give me one thing that you've learned either about yourself or leadership in the past 6 months.
I think the last 6 months have been a colossal bummer. And I think I have realised probably some things about the importance, the things about the importance of the church. And I think what I've been surprised by at times is how the things I have missed from the gathered church have evolved over the last 6 months. So I probably thought that there'd be certain things that you'd miss throughout the entire process that might be just, and you're like, I'm desperate to get back to that, like sharing communion with people. And as it's gone on, I've realized that that's ebbed and flowed. At times it's been that, at times it's been singing, at times it's been a context for public preaching or hearing of the words, and sometimes it's just missing friends, and it's very strange. I think that ebb and flow of the loss of the church, but why the loss of the church is painful, has been really surprising to me. And I think I'm coping much better now than I was in the summer with that loss. But I found that whole thing, I mean, everyone has, obviously very weird, but it's weird the ways in which it's been weird for me. So yeah, that's been a surprise.
I love that. I want to stay with that before we move on, because you shared things about this before with me that I found deeply challenging. Because I do hear a lot of people just celebrating, of course, the advent of online church. And it's in its heyday now. We've all realised that we were wrong to insist on in-person church, and now look at this. We can do online church.
Who needs them? Exactly. Gnosticism, rah, rah, rah. All words to that effect.
Exactly. So what are some of your concerns with online church, or what are some of the things you think we're learning as a church about the importance of embodiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably my concern about online church is I don't think it really exists, which you know very well. But I think, I mean, it's obviously it's better than nothing, isn't it? I think that the nice thing about it is that it means that if you're in a situation like this, or if in quite normal times you are too unwell or too elderly or frail or whatever to be able to leave the home, then you can still feel a sense of connection to what's going on in the gathered church. I think that's great. But I think as soon as it becomes a substitute, I have no concern if people know this is the analogy I always use is this is like an online church is like an online marriage. Like, I think, of course, if you were away from Amy for 9 months on the high seas in a battleship somewhere in the South Atlantic because you're in the Navy, then okay, fair enough. You can remain married, and it's not that you can't Skype or Zoom or whatever it was, and it's not like your marriage suddenly ceases to exist. But anybody who thought that was somehow a replacement, or I heard a Christian leader you would have heard of, a lot of our listeners would have heard of, talking about how the thing that they ran was just doing so much better in the online era because people were more real and I was thinking, I don't know, that may or may not be what you may truly believe that, I don't know, but I'm very concerned if in the name of gathering a larger number of people through this sort of platform in this kind of world, that you end up celebrating it rather than mourning it and saying this is a tragedy, like an online marriage is a tragedy. It might be needed for a certain time because of awful things happening. You might be at war. My grandfather and my grandmother wrote to each other for 3.5 years, but they didn't see each other because of being in a POW camp. So these things do happen, but I think to say that then when you get back together again, you go, oh no, actually this is awful. It's just as good. You can stay at home. I think this is a disaster. Now, I don't think many people are going to do that, but I'm always optimistic about that sort of thing, and I might be wrong. My hope is that when people feel that they are safe and that the kinds of meetings we're having are close enough approximations to what they're used to, they will come back. I think we are at the moment in an odd twilight period, though, where the church meetings, as and when people do attend them, are so weird and different. And first one I went to, I found quite upsetting, actually. I was just so weirded out by everyone in masks, no singing, that I sort of thought, I don't want to go back to that. And I think a lot of people are experiencing something like that, which may mean it takes quite a while for the numbers to return when things are eventually lifted. But I'd certainly think anything that treats online as a substitute for real church is a very bad idea.
You said something to me a few months ago that really stuck with me, that we believe what we do. It's about the importance of habit forming. Explain. So that was part of why you were concerned that churches are closed, and there didn't seem to be, at the time that we were talking, much energy or enthusiasm from the point of pastors to regather, because they were thinking, oh, this is good, we're getting Sunday rests and we're all online and that's fine. And you were saying, no, that I'm concerned for the health of the church because we believe what we do, and so there's a concern that people will just stop believing. Would you go so far as to say that, or what did you mean exactly by that comment?
I think it's true that I think basically people go to church because they believe in God, but they also believe in God because they go to church. There's sociologists talk about plausibility structures, and the existence of the church is a plausibility structure, namely something that reinforces the plausibility of the thing that you believe. And of course, it's not only Christians who do that. Secular people have it. Everybody has it. Every religious or non-religious community has it. And in many ways, watching Netflix is a plausibility structure for secular materialism. And we are always involved in bodily and mental and sometimes even spiritual practices, the purpose of which is partly to reinforce the narrative about the world that we believe. And if you live as we do, in a society which is very good at doing that from a materialist or a secular or a liberal or progressive standpoint, but you remove the plausibility structure that it reinforces Christian faith, which is the primary one of which is the local church, then you end up making Christians weaker. And I think that's what's happened. I think Christians are. I think, some of us will express it like, I'm tired, or I'm just more. And people, of course, we all put it down to lockdown and coronavirus, which is absolutely right. But I think what we'll find is that one of the things that happens is when people get out of the habit of being part of the gathered church, they are at risk of getting too used to it and of continuing to be out of the habit of it once the church does regather again. Now, as I've just said, I'm not that concerned about that being a mass thing, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are a whole bunch of people, particularly those with perhaps less spiritual maturity, for whom that is a huge threat. And I heard in a totally different context a political commentator a few months back saying that lockdown was really living off your fat reserves, that the reason why home working, you're now speaking from inside your shed in your garden, the reason why home work can work, he was saying, and even in large offices, is because we're living off our fat reserves of relational capital we built up with people through personal interaction. But that you'd make a withdrawal each day of lockdown or each day of this kind of system. And there comes a day where you just don't have it. New people have been added. You've never physically met them. And I think we'll find the same thing can be true for the church, that you might feel like, I'm living off the gain of being part of a church, yet I don't have to go. Yay, win-win. And then you think, no, because each of those things you are taking out both your investment in others and their investment in you. And the point comes where you just feel apathetic and a sort of torpor sets in and you don't really want to participate anymore and you don't really know why. And I think that is a genuine risk, particularly for people who are very tired. So that's a more of an observation. I'm not paranoid about it, I don't think, but I do think it's...
No, but I think it's a helpful observation of how belief works. And that's to say nothing of truthfulness of a thing, but you're absolutely right. It's the way in which a plausibility, believability of something is reinforced. Yeah. And that's in part been the concern that we've all championed the cause of our communities, which has been great by and large, but we've championed them at the exclusion of saying, at the same time as saying, well, this is obviously perhaps more important than what I do in my local church. And is the local church, does that have any lasting importance? And there's a concern generally about the weakening of the church in the face of an advancing secularism, or just quite a militant, aggressive secularism. And so that's where I really want to come on to is how, there have been massive social changes in the last couple of decades, obviously. And the pandemic has brought some of those to light, where people have had more time at home and issues that were previously going on and bubbling away in the background have burst to the surface and have generated a lot of attention. I'd just like to get a kind of snapshot from you of some of the major social changes or political changes that you think have taken place over the last few decades that are having a big impact on the church and on Christians in general? Is that too big a question?
It's a pretty large question. I mean, I'll have a go, but I don't quite know. Tell me about all the things that have changed in the last 50 years and how they affect the church and what we should do about them. 2 minutes, go. I mean, the one of the most obvious, particularly given what we're doing now, is technological. So I think, again, habits form us, and if you look at the way in which people, step back for a second. What happens when we consider social change? This is something that I think goes back originally to the historian Fernand Braudel. He says what happens is social change takes place at 3 levels, and it's like you think about a giant ocean of social change. What you see is the waves on the surface. You see like I did this morning, very windy day, waves breaking. That looks to you, that's all you can see, and that looks like the most interesting, newsworthy bit. That's presidential elections. That's political decisions. It's even coronavirus outbreaks in certain ways. It's sort of the visible surface level of change. Underneath that, you have things like tides. You have actually deeper forces, which you can't see, but you can see the effects of them if you stick around for 6 or 12 hours. You can see, the sea's moving in and the sea's moving out. But they're not visible, but you know that those things are perhaps more important. And those might be things like technological developments are of that nature, and larger social movements. The sexual revolution would be, in the last 50 years, would probably be the most obvious one of those, where the relationships between men and women, the number of women in the workplace, gay rights, transgender rights, many, many things like that, which have come out of it, divorce, abortion, many, many, factors like that, which is quite a large, so you can see it, and it's taking place under the surface, but you can see the effects. And then the third level is the sort of deep ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, things which over thousands of years have just been flowing the same sort of way, but they make northern Scotland quite a lot warmer in winter than Atlantic Canada, even though Scotland is hundreds of miles to the north of Atlantic Canada, because there's this huge deep flow within the ocean that you can't see, and you almost have to be told that it's there, otherwise you wouldn't quite believe it. But those deep level social changes about the way in which ordinary people live their lives. And I think if you analyze culture that way, you'd say, there's a lot of things going on in the present. There's COVID, there's Trump, there's riots, there's, obviously a lot of the race conversations come to the surface in the last 6 months, appropriately so. But so there are a lot of things like that which you'd point to. Then the sort of the tidal middle level you've got, and you're thinking about things like probably technological developments and the sexual revolution, the sexual revolution probably will have more long-lasting impact, actually. It's more of a third, the sort of lowest tier. And the lowest tier, you'd say, what are the most significant developments of the last 100 or 200 years? And it would be things like people don't work on the land anymore. Most people are increasingly living in cities. Population is gradually, Europe was a fifth of the world's population 100 years ago. Now it's a tiny fraction of that. Africa is going to be a third of the world's population within 50 years. All those sorts of trends. And very few people in the world are farmers, and a tiny percentage of people create enough food for everyone else. And so most of us work in offices, and we are living longer. Those sorts of trends, which are much deeper. Although if you're told them, you go, oh yeah, but they're not the things you notice day to day in the news. And I think if you think that sort of threefold triage, the reason I laugh is partly because you could answer that question at any one of those levels, couldn't you? I think the lowest one is always the most significant. I think the kinds of lives that ordinary people are leading now relative to 100 years ago is ultimately pastorally a more significant question to wrestle with. But I think if you just take the last 20 years, I think the key development, the internet and the mobile technology are probably going to be the things, I would guess from now, that you will look back on in 50 years' time and say that was the key development of the first 20 years of the 21st century, just like the key development of the previous 30 or 40 years would have been the sexual revolution and its consequences. So that's probably the digital world, I expect, would be the biggest one.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And so you did do it. See, in 2 minutes, a short history of everything. Andrew Wilson, well done. Well, as someone who trains emerging leaders and is a pastor and a teacher, what are some of the areas in church life and in conversations with Christians that you see the waves of the surface of things really having an impact on the people that you're teaching and training? So where are some of the things that you've noticed things have changed and the things that you're having to talk more about, or the confidence levels of the Christians that you're engaging with, where are they finding things hardest at the moment?
Yeah, I don't think that really happens at the deepest ocean current level at all, in that people don't really think about it. It's something that's very gradually shaping us all, and we're not really aware of it. Although I think in the long run, if I comment on that for a moment, in some ways people don't notice it, but they will, and that'll be things like how do you build churches, and how do you build even functioning societies in which people are living as much longer as they used to? How do you live a functioning life in retirement if you're retired for more than a third of your life, which is true of an increasing number of people in our society? How do you fund it given aging populations, and that the median age of Europe is sort of going up and up and up and up and up, and the median age of many other countries, median age in Africa at the moment is 19 and a half. Median age in Europe is like 45, 47, that sort of thing. So you realize that disparity is that raises the desire even for things like large levels of cultural immigration over the next 50 years in order to be able to provide enough young people to fund the old people, but that's going to present all sorts of big cultural challenges. So in many ways, they're not the questions people ask, but I wanted to throw them in anyway, because I think the third level is actually the deepest level, is the ones that you don't even notice because they take much longer to kick in. A lot of people ask about the top level, but I think you can largely dismiss. That's more like, what's your comment on this? What do you think about? And some of them do feed through. Some of them clearly have a big impact. Donald Trump is an example where I think, in the long run, you go, oh, well, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, very different people, but it hasn't made that much difference to the experience of living in Britain other than probably Brexit. Whereas something like Trump, you'd go, that has actually done quite a lot to America and thereby to the world in raising the stakes on certain debates and issues and so on. But I think the main thing that comes up in training leaders is the middle tier, is the things which people are smart enough to see this is a significant trend, and things like technology. And I think, as I say, the sexual revolution would be the one where, and in some ways people trace it back to the late 1960s, but I think we haven't actually seen a number of the fruits of the sexual revolution until the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the church. So still, I would say the biggest change since I started training, since you and I did Warrant Impact when I was in 2004 or whatever, that's 15 or 16 years ago when we first met, I guess. And on that course, I probably covered sexual ethics a little bit. And even when I did, I might well have done it in the context of reproductive ethics rather than, are people in this room genuinely going to need convincing that Christian marriage is between one man and one woman? Now, although I know people on a leadership course are going to need to be taught, I will teach on that stuff, and I know that they'll believe it. They need to be taught why it's good, how it works, what the sort of underlying anthropology of it is, why it's theologically defensible as well as biblically proof text defensible, how to articulate it in a church context, how to articulate it in a secular context, in the media, all kinds of things. So I now spend a lot more time talking about something like that. Flipping it around, I think when I started doing training, I probably spent a lot more time talking about new atheism was just becoming a thing. 2005, 6, the God delusion, God is not great. That's largely faded. I just find those sorts of arguments, the idea that religion is the cause of all violence, that was a very post 9/11 phenomenon. That was Iraq War. That was George Bush, Dick Cheney, and again, that's how the top slice of culture feeds into the next one down, where there has been a tidal movement. The tide has just gone out on the new atheism. And now people don't worry about admitting they're Christians because they think they're going to sound stupid, probably, as much as they think they're going to sound bigoted or morally reprehensible. And I think that's probably at an apologetic level, or in terms of equipping the church or preaching or engaging in the secular world. The concern is much more, I'm a backward bigot rather than I am an idiot who doesn't understand the way the world really works. It's not anti-science, it's anti-gay, it's whatever it might be. So I think that's probably the major trend when it comes to training and apologetics.
So that's fantastic to hear. Fantastic to hear. It's a brilliant overview.
So enjoy the tide.
I've forgotten what I was going to say. I think so. The new atheist movement, fascinating. I've not thought about that until you said it. Actually, that I don't feel embarrassed on an intellectual level anymore telling my non-Christian friends I'm a Christian, and in part that's because I have, undergirded my faith with some thinking and reading and listening about matters of science and faith.
Yeah.
So has the new atheism in large part gone away because Christians backfilled with replies to those arguments, or has it gone away because in the culture at large, people by and large just think, well, God doesn't exist, so we don't even need to argue about that anymore?
No, I don't think it's the second at all. I think they might think the Christian God doesn't exist, or they might think the Christian God, if he does exist, doesn't have we can't really tell us what to do. But I certainly don't think we're seeing a massive rise of atheism in a proper sense. I think their culture is as spiritual, as likely to say they believe in God as it probably ever has been. I've been, as you know, for other reasons, been reading a lot of 18th century writings recently, and the state of Christianity in the nation is in many ways far better than it was in the 18th century in terms of people's belief in God and prepared to go by broadly Christian values on all manner of things, actually. So I don't think it's that at all. I don't think people go, no, we know God doesn't exist. There are some, probably up to, the sociologists use the category of nuns, of people who just tick no religion or none on a box in the census. But of those nuns, which now comprise, again, this is North American, I think, they're about 25% of the population. There's actually a small subsection of that. It might be sort of somewhere between 5 and 10% who would say, I'm atheist. There is no God. That's how I'm done. The other 15 are, no, I might well be very spiritual. Many of them say, I pray every day. Many of them say, I believe in God, or I believe in a spiritual thought. So I don't think it's that people have just suddenly changed their belief. I do think, though, that over the last, this is a much sort of deeper level trend, but over the last 200 or 300 years, a lot fewer people, obviously 500 years, a lot fewer people are going to church and formally adhering to a traditional denomination. So, but when it comes to the new atheism, I think what's really happening there is that people, Richard Dawkins, for all I know, the arguments he puts forward in the God delusion may well be the very reasons why he doesn't believe in God and why he always hasn't. But I suspect that what happens for most of his readers, and sometimes for writers, is really that the way you defend your rejection of the Christian God is not necessarily the overriding reason why you came to that belief. It is the most accessible and consumer-friendly way of explaining why you don't like believing in God in a particular generational moment, which 15 years ago was 9/11, Al-Qaeda, George Bush, all the rest. Now, you say it's much easier to say, no, by virtue of being a Christian, you are a transphobe, a homophobe, a racist, or whatever it might be. And that's partly because of Trump, and it's partly because of other things. And that'll morph again. And in the 1980s, funny, I can't quite reach one from here, but I've got a number of books which shows that, engaging in theological debate in the 80s and 90s, and they're all trying to push back against people who are taking the Jesus story, scholars and leading in American universities, saying, basically, we've got to get rid of the apocalyptic Jesus who believed in the end of the world, because they're worried about Ronald Reagan and Star Wars and communism and this sort of good versus evil thing. And every generation does it. You say that's the battle we're going to fight. So I don't think the new atheism, in that sense, most of those people who were reading and quoting Richard Dawkins 15 years ago, they're still there and they still don't believe in God. It's just that's not the way they're going about it now. They've now either become woke warriors or anti-woke free speech warriors. And it's I've read some interesting stuff even on how that movement is effectively split in half, and the people who are a bit more, progressive leaning have gone, we're going to become, maybe take with the kind of people who are in downtown Portland at the moment, wearing black masks and shouting that everybody's a fascist, or they might be the guys who have gone into the dark web and are saying, you guys are trying to crush, which of course is more the direction that Dawkins himself and Sam Harris have gone in. So Chris Hitchens has died. Daniel Dennett's still a professor, but of those four guys, it's fragmented even amongst them, let alone amongst the people who followed them. So I don't think we're seeing everybody goes, oh, I don't care. I think what we're seeing is that social movements have redirected the energies of those people who are stridently anti the Christian God or anti any other God, and they now articulate that agenda in very different ways.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And that bears out in my experience as well. I think the amount of people I meet these days who I'm not having to convince them God exists. I'm having to convince them God has a name and a will and is of a particular type.
Yes, or God is good, or yeah.
And that's what I'm finding so fascinating is, particularly you mentioned the sexual revolution and the changing attitude to gay rights and trans rights. That's where this rubber really hits the road. Is I want a God who doesn't tell me unpopular things and lets me have as much sexual freedom as I want. how do you? I mean, because it was in one sense easy. Easy, I say, to see a solution to the problem. When you're a Christian and people think you're stupid, with a bit of study and a bit, a bit of articulation, you can convince people I'm not stupid. However, how do you make the Christian vision of sexual flourishing, human flourishing, sorry, how do you present that in a way that kind of helps give the average Christian confidence that we're not, transphobe, homophobe, and we're not bigots? Because that does seem to be why a lot of Christians don't have confidence to say they're Christian anymore, or they quickly slink out of any conversations that turn political or moral, because we feel like we've lost any moral high ground. I think Mark Sayers says for the first time in Christian history, we're now considered less moral than the society around us in our attitude towards things like that. What would be your encouragement to Christians who are?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I actually don't agree with Mark about that particular point. I think that I think he is right that in our culture, we Christians have had the moral high ground for a long time. But I think if you go back to the second century church, before really the merger of church and state in the fourth century, I think you would say Christians are regarded as morally reprehensible people, just for the opposite reasons that we would now. Christians are regarded as stupid and morally depraved people. And Tacitus said it about the reason about Nero setting Christians on fire in Paul's day. So saying these guys were just like, they were the hatred of the human race. They were despised, a terrible group of people. They were, as you know, accused later of incest for Christian marriage and of cannibalism for eating the Lord's Supper. There was all kinds of things, and of being this depraved superstition of women and slaves and children, which of course now, because of Christianity, those things are all held up as being good things. If you're attractive to women and slaves and children, people would say, oh, well done you. But back then that was regarded as degraded. So I actually don't think it's true. But I accept the broader point that in our culture, we're having to get used to being on the morally wrong side of the argument again. And I think we're actually back where the church was a very long time ago. And I mean, I think you got to read your own position and relationships and your own capacity for engaging in this sort of thing, haven't you? I think there are people who need to do this sort of thing very thoroughly, a bit like with New Atheism, actually. 15 years ago, there would have been people who'd say, oh, this person's into Dawkins, I'm just going to drop it. I don't know enough about evolutionary biology to go into that on this one. And I think there will be many people for whom that's to some degree, and with many people they know, if people are picking a fight, that's actually appropriate. Of course, if your mum or your brother or someone is really going at you about something, you may well need to give more of a response than that. But a lot of the time, some of us will just need to, do what Jeremiah does when confronted with the false prophet Hananiah, and he just shrugs and walks away and goes, I'm not going to win this one now. I'm just going to give it time. And I think that's okay for many of us a lot of the time. I don't think I can do that. I don't think you can do that as a pastor and a trainer, but I think many of us probably should some of the time. But when it comes to articulating a Christian vision of sexuality and, moral goodness, I think you have to ask different questions about, if you take sex, I think you have to ask different questions about sex than we're used to asking. I think even in my teenage years, or probably early 20s, the questions that were asked about sex were things to do with who you're going to have sex with and when, and maybe even like how. But those would be the questions. If you're trying to teach people about sex, that's where you'd go. I think now the question is much deeper than that. And it's basically, what is sex and what's it for? And why has God made it this way? And I think often when you ask that of people, they don't really know, or their functional answer to what sex is something like, I often crack this, but it's like, it's a pleasurable consenting experience between two adults. It might as well be tandem skydiving just without clothes on. It's like, it doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't point beyond itself, except it's simply that someone does to get a physical rush of some sort, and they get some endorphins and they all go, now I feel a bit nicer. It's like a drug transaction in that sense. It's a way of triggering your hormones or your organs to do something. And at the end of that, you're done. Now, that's a very low, cheap, and unsatisfactory view of sex, which completely destroys not just the divine transcendence of it, but even from a completely secular person, the sense of mystery and withholding yourself for one other person and intimacy and closeness. And of course, it doesn't really work, because as soon as you say to people, if you actually consistently said this is just a way of having a physical experience, then issues like sexual violence wouldn't have anything like the hold on us that they rightly do as morally, dramatically serious issues, because you'd say, well, in the end, it's really an issue of physical pain caused or permanent harm done. And if you haven't done that, then what's the problem with it? And of course, we all say, what are you talking about? Sex means far more than that. So there's a transcendence and a significance to human sexuality that's much larger. And when you start talking about why and saying, what is it that it does? And you say, well, actually, within the Christian vision of human flourishing, sexuality points beyond itself. It points to the mystery of Christ and the church. It points to the mystery of heaven and earth and creation. It points to the mystery of worshiping God and union with God. And I'm not surprised that, given that you don't think it means those things, you don't really understand why I would constrain it the way I do. I get that. But could you see, though, that the reason that, given that I do think it does mean those things, means, of course, I'm going to think that it's going to be constrained in ways that you might not, and that it isn't only an issue of consent, but actually there are other things going on here. There is union and communion and otherness and fidelity and permanence and covenant and things like these, are transcendence, actually, which I think if you think hard about it, you might realize you also share some of them as well, even if in a slightly diluted form, because your assumptions about what sex is have been Christianized, whether you like it or not, by the last 2,000 years of Christian ethical teaching. So now people will express that case at different levels of depth, and some will avoid it altogether. But I think that underneath the questions about, no, you're not allowed to do this and they're not allowed to do that, and what should the law be and who gets to marry who, the story I've often told, you've heard me tell it several times, I'm sure, is that when these two, just after gay marriage was gay marriage was obviously going to become legal. It was about 2014, 2015, that sort of time. I bumped into two teenage girls in our welcome area at church. And I said, how do you find the service? We were chatting. And they said, look, the thing for me about Christianity is I just don't understand why you think that two people who love each other can't get married. And I said, why two? Why not three? Why not five? Why not eight? Why can't I be married to, my wife, and she's married to her sister, and I'm married to the dog, or whatever? Where's that come from? And they didn't really know what to say. They hadn't thought about it. And it's partly because they didn't realize how they also carry all kinds of unprovable assumptions about what human sexuality is. And I think I'm just saying, I think my vision of that is just way, way older, way more widely shared in the world's population even now, and way more defensible theologically than yours. Although I understand you may not have thought about it.
Yeah, because I do think that the reason people object to the Christian position isn't in large part about sex. It is about love, or at least that's how the argument's been framed. Love is love, and so people aren't saying I should be allowed to have sex with whoever I want. But they are saying I should be allowed to love whoever I want and form a close and intimate bond with whoever I want. And you Christians are stopping me do that.
No, and of course, that's what I don't precisely what I don't think I am stopping. I'm saying, of course, I think you should. I actually think this is where the church has often got this wrong. It's like the church has often shied away from the idea that you should be able to have a close and intimate relational bond with somebody of the same sex as you. I mean, not in historically that hasn't been true, but more recently I think it has. There's an awful lot of Christians who read accounts of friendship between men even 60 or 70 years ago in war and find it a little bit, ooh, that sounds a bit gay. And they think, no, relational intensity of love for other human beings, closeness of affection, where two women who are lifelong friends can live in the same house for the rest of their lives and love one another deeply without having anything sexual to it, has always been part of human. In fact, that's Christian traditions around monasteries and convents, let alone men at war and so on. So that's not what I'm not talking about that at all. If somebody by love is love means I should be able to love anybody I want, I say, well, I think that's actually just the second commandment. I think that's Jesus saying, love God, love your neighbor. We're not, but that isn't all you're saying. You're saying I want that love to be expressed sexually if I choose to, and that's where I do think the debate is actually about sex rather than about love. And I think one of the things we have to do pastorally as in the church is to help, particularly those who are attracted to people of the same sex, but actually everybody, form better, loving friendships that are thoroughly unsexualized. And it's just our culture is so effective at catechizing us on everything is sexual. Every time you look at something like that, it is basically sexual. Of course, if you give somebody a hug, it's a bit gay. All those sorts of things. He's got so good at doing that, even in a humorous way, let alone a serious one, that we have to sort of anti-catechize in that sense to teach people, no. If you, whether you are gay or straight, the way in which your friendship should work should be characterized probably more intimacy, not less. It's just it mustn't be sexualized.
Is that attitude towards sexuality something that is something that's downstream from people like Freud, who essentially said we are sexual creatures who want to devour?
Totally.
And so our society. So you're saying that pre-Freud, people didn't think like that about sexuality or human meaning and purpose as being fundamentally sexual.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people did before Freud, and some people don't after him. And of course, but I would say that in the sort of intellectual history, there's quite a turning point really around the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, where psychology effectively even nowadays. You study psychology at even university, did you? Maybe you did it.
My wife did. I just study it for fun.
Okay, but I mean, in that case, she would know much better than I. But an awful lot of people today would reject almost every single testable claim that Freud made, but they would still operate with a deeper assumption that what fundamentally defines a person's identity is bound up with their sexual drives. And that's true even for people who say, oh no, the different phases we thought children went through, that's all absolutely hooey. But I still think I still assume that there is something right about that way of processing what a human being is. And so I wouldn't want to make him like a sort of, until then it was this before Freud and after Freud. But yeah, there has definitely been a huge transition in the last 100 years, which is why people's essential sense of self is so bound up with their sexuality now. And some of that is also connected to the, institutional religion having a weaker hold on people. So whereas if I said to you, who are you in the 16th century, you might say, I'm a Protestant, or I'm an Anglican, or I'm a Catholic. And then you might say, I'm English, and you might say, whatever it might be. There would be different ways of ranking it. When people talk about that now, national identity is still there, but it's lower down the list. Religious identity is, for many people, all but gone. Even if they do believe in God, they don't identify themselves that way. And their sexual identity or other forms, like their gender identity, which is obviously a different thing, and or their racial identity might be uppermost in that list. And so it's not uncommon for somebody to say, to start introduce themselves almost as a gay man or as a trans woman, or that's how they primarily think about who they are. That's a very recent development. That just isn't how there was a lot of gay sex in the ancient world, right? Paul you see it in the Greek writers, you see it in Latin writers, and you see it in Paul. But that's not how they thought about who they were as humans. Whereas I think with the erosion of other meta identities like religious affiliation or whatever, you find, and even tribal identities, which have been very strong for most people, with those things fade, you find a new tribe, you find a new home, a new way of saying, oh, that's who I am, and this group of people is the people with whom I fit, and that's the gay community or the trans community, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that's why the stakes are so high, because it sounds like it's a bit like in the 16th century, if you disagree with someone on Protestantism, you end up trying to drown each other because their Protestantism was the defining feature of who they were. That's no longer true, but instead it's their sexual identity as the defining feature, which is why it feels like such an assault on their sense of self if you say, I don't think you can have sex with someone of the same sex as you.
Wow, that's really helpful. Such a helpful way of putting things, and even framing it in that just a wider historical context. Because part of the challenge we've got is we're all I remember John Piper using the phrase of being sucked into the abyss of the present. We're just so consumed with a present mindset that we cannot imagine what it was like to think and live before the 19th century, for example. But I read recently Viktor Frankl's experience of so he was a Jewish Holocaust survivor and psychologist and therapist, and I don't know if he developed it, but he talks about a form of understanding human persons that is in direct opposition or contrast to Freud, who says we're not fundamentally sexual beings, we're fundamentally meaning-making beings, and we need meaning and purpose. Yeah. And so that's where, although I think there is still this sense that people, like you said rightly, that people want to have sex with whoever they want, at a deeper level, because meaning and community, like I think Jonathan hates stuff about being essentially community beings, or what's the phrase that he's got? I can't remember. But I think that's deeper, it seems, than sexuality. and so people would still be saying, no, but I want to have meaning and purpose in life, and that is bound up in close and intimate relationships with another person. And so by outlawing marriage to gay people, for example, you are stopping them being able to have the kind of close partnership that heterosexual people seem to be able to enjoy, which is a big part of their meaning for life. The concerns are that when my loved one dies, if we're not legally joined, then I don't get anything, and it's as though we never existed, and that's a tragedy, because we've built everything, we've made a life, we've made something meaningful together. So there seem to be not just the longing for sex and love, but for a deeper level for meaning and purpose to their life. Do those statements ring true? What would you say to things like that?
They all do. Again, I think if people said, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do all of those things, I'm just going to do it celibately, I'd say, knock yourself out. Great. That's exactly what human friendship should be. So I think what happens is people say the things you're saying, and will almost explicitly say, no, this isn't about sex. It's so much bigger than that. And say, okay, well, what if we just said, no, we took sex out. So this is not, and I don't just mean we took away sexual intercourse. I mean, we don't sexualize this relationship. That's not how we think about what's happening here. That actually, there, of course, is a much, much better pedigree of relational language for this in human history than gay married couple or gay lover, which is that of brother or sister. And that's something that all societies everywhere, and we of course still do, but all societies have used as a way of describing the kind of, even, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother, that sort of biblical language, but even just the idea that people do talk about brothers in arms or band of brothers or whatever, that has always been, I'm using male language, but it just applies to sisters as well. And when you use terms like that, I think what it exposes is, if I was to take sex out of this picture, you would feel like something fundamental had been stolen from what you see this relationship as being, which is why I do think it's ultimately about sexuality and the transcendence of sex in our culture, rather than simply but if I took sex away and you said, that's great, that's exactly what I want, and I say, well, in that case, great, but I don't think you're really talking about gay marriage then. I think you're talking about a deep intimacy of fraternal friendship that is a beautiful thing with an incredibly long history that Jesus himself lived in, and John the Baptist and Paul and many, many others of our heroes of the faith, both in scripture and since. And you should, not only can you pursue that, you should. So that's why I do think it still does come down to an issue of, I do think that sex is still a big part of this puzzle, even if I think people would want to say that's not the main reason. I think probably in practical terms, there's some middle ground in the middle, which is people who say, middle ground in the middle, where else would the middle ground be? I ask myself. But it's where people are not only, they're saying, no, it's not just about sex, but nor do I just want the brother thing. I want, a phrase you often hear, I want someone to come home to at the end of the day. And I think in an environment like that, we can still affirm what I've just been saying, but need to additionally recognize that the model of society that has, lots and lots of tiny nuclear family units makes life much more alienating for those people who are not in those tiny family units, particularly in the church. And that the work that has to be done in the church, which I imagine is part of what we're talking about, is not only to comment on the social trend, but actually to build church family in such a way that a person who is not in a nuclear family, might live in a flat with somebody else, who might live on their own, or a house on their own, a very big house on their own, but they don't live as defined by relationships with wife and 3 kids or whatever it might be. That the family of God functions in such a way that person is not either left out or regarded in any way as a second-class citizen, and wouldn't regard themselves that way for not being in a smaller family unit. And I think the fact that our culture has the extended family's got, this is a sort of ocean current level development, isn't it? The extended family has gradually collapsed and lost its meaning for people. It's not a place that they go in white middle class communities like the ones we're much talking about, not everywhere. But I think because that's gone, then it's very difficult for people to find that sort of larger network of relationships without sort of thinking I need to be married to somebody, because that is what society has preached them to believe, not least through the church. So I do have a lot of sympathy. At a sociological level, I'm commenting and saying this is why I think it's really about sex. But at an individual level, with gay friends of mine, I'm going, I totally see why that's like that and why the appeal is so strong. I still think a lot of it is about sex. But if it's only about the other thing, I think we need to find ways of building families and living arrangements even that don't force us into that binary of I'm either married to somebody or I'm on my own, which is not a biblical way of thinking at all.
No, because I was thinking when you shared earlier about the early church's challenge of being ostracized and hated and seen as being immoral in a society in the ancient world, that was very difficult, and like you were rightly pointing out, comparable to our situation with regards to that issue. But what the early church had was social structure and social glue and communities that held them together. And I think probably one of the biggest impacts of the sexual revolution that has led to this conversation is the disintegration and destabilization of the family and community life, to the point where I read a statistic the other day that said 50% of children growing up in this country by the age of their 16th birthday won't be living with either of their birth parents. Or one or either of their birth parents. That's shocking, and that has huge ramifications for a society. And we're now, people talk about there are many different types of family, which seems to me to be another way of just accepting broken family as normal now. And that, of course, it makes it a lot harder for us as Christians to do that. So just as we come into land, I'd love to, I didn't anticipate us necessarily spending the whole time talking about sexuality, but I think it's a really helpful observation that 10, 15 years ago, it was the neo-atheists and that was the main issue for Christian confidence. And now it seems to be homophobia and issues like this. So it's been really helpful to have that conversation.
Good.
What would you say then to someone who is in a church? What can they do to help cultivate deeper social bonds and communities of love and intimacy that help make singleness and celibacy not just plausible but desirable again?
Well, so this is not the only answer, but it's one I'd throw out because it might not be the first thing you'd often hear. I think all of us need to think seriously about our living arrangements. And by this I mean, I've got, as you know, married, 3 children, dog. Right, the house it's not full. We've got a nice house, but there's plenty of people in it, plenty of living beings in it already. Our dog is larger than our children, and but I think all of us need to return and say, okay, this bubble that I'm in, is this actually the best way of cultivating family in this season of my life? And what we've done, I did this a couple of years ago. It would be slightly out of date now, but when I hosted a conference, which I know you were at, and where I just threw this challenge out there in the context of a discussion about sexuality, and just said, at the time of speaking, it was about, we'd been married 15 years, and we'd spent about half of it with at least one other person living with us, and half of it not. And so I'm not saying this is a rule that all families must have a single person living with them, but I think if people are not asking that question, certainly if we've got, as most of us do, the space to get 2 of our kids to share a room or whatever it might be and free up a room, which many of us listening to this probably would by the time they're the age that you and I are, and probably a fair bit younger, then if we're not asking the question, then something's gone a bit awry, because we're really saying that this is mine, that's my space, and it's no one else's. And I think the same is true of single people as well. And I've thrown this challenge the other way and said, if you go buy a flat on your own, I just think you should very seriously consider whether that is actually the most helpful thing for you and for those in the community around you for your long-term flourishing and happiness. Not to say it isn't, it might well be. There might be kind of good reasons why that's important. Or it might be a seasonal thing where sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But I think we need to put that on the table, because in the end, a home is such a key part of how we express the non-functional areas of human life, isn't it? I can have transactional friendships and relationships with people, and even what we're doing now, you and I are good friends, but we're speaking in work time with our earphones in over a screen. It's very fun. The friendship that you and I have comes from when our kids are around and we go for a walk in the woods, or when we come around and hang out at yours in the evening or whatever. Obviously, by the rule of 6. But the point is that's where intimacy happens much of the time, is in non-transactional moments. And I think people can smell it. Like if you say, well, no, of course we're going to include, but we're going to do it on our schedule in the bits of the day or week when it works for us as an appointment rather than as part of our family life, then I think that's always going to subtly communicate you are not truly part of us. And I think both families and single people, both old and young, have a lot to gain from just revisiting that question. So rather than giving you 5 things, I'd give you one thing and just spend a bit more time on it to try and push the point. There are many others as well, I'm sure, but that would be where I'd start.
That's really helpful. And I can see how at a deeper culture level, you mentioned the future problem that we're going to have a society of people living a third of their life potentially in in retirement age. The responsibility and need perhaps for those of retirement age to not stop thinking of themselves as mothers and fathers and older brothers and older sisters, because I see that so much, particularly among people in pastoral ministry, the longing to be fathered and mothered by someone. And because they've moved away, because of social migration, they've moved away from their family they grew up with. Their mums and dads don't live with them. There's still that craving and that aching in the heart to have an older person look at them and say, I must decrease and you must increase. And that is the sorts of things that I think people are longing to hear, that helps with that sort of thing too. Andrew, it's been so rich and so helpful, and I would love to just keep talking to you for hours on end about all sorts of things. Please come back in the future and help us tease open and think through another issue that's facing us as well. So thank you so much for your time.
It's lovely to be with you.
I look forward to having you round, socially distanced in the rule of 6, and enjoying an evening together soon. But God bless you. Speak to you soon.